Welcome back to Theory, Part 3 of 3. This is kind of the meatiest part of the presentation, and also for most of you, it will be the most relevant and the most interesting. So it's a little bit longer, but it's also going to be very applicable to those of you that are interested in pediatrics and how you structure what you do with kids. So we have a few different pediatric frames of reference: Reilly, Lawrence, motor learning and skills acquisition, biomechanical, Bobath, and Ayres. And we'll go through them one at a time. Mary Reilly had a theory of occupational behavior. It's from the late 60s. She described play, and her theory is all about play. Play being the central occupation for children and the central way that children learn. So she talked about play as a system that children use to guide their development, and talked about 3 stages of play: exploring, competence, and achievement. So you start off, you're just looking around at stuff. Then children use play to become competent, in other words, to build skills. And finally, children use play in order to reach various levels of achievement and to have that internal sense of achievement as well. Lawrence, Leila Lawrence, actually was an instructor at San Jose State and she's pretty brilliant. So she was the 1969 Eleanor Clark Slagle Lecturer, and if you haven't checked out that lecture, it's pretty awesome. So do that in your spare time. Her theory was developmental. She talked about how development can be facilitated, and OT assists in helping individuals master life tasks. So she looked at 3 different types of life tasks and relationship focuses: physical, psychological, and social. Then we get to motor learning and motor skills acquisition. Here's a little overview. The focus of this theory is on getting goal-directed functional actions to happen in one's life, and in this case, in a child's life. It is the interaction between the child's capacity and the task or environment. So one part is the kid's skill. The other part is, what is the task? Is it accessible? Is it doable? And also, is the environment hindering or helping? So say we have a child who's in a wheelchair, right? And the task is to get out from school to the playground. Well, there's the child's capacity. Are they able to actually wheel their wheelchair? Do they have the strength, the endurance, the ability to steer, the attention, all of that? Then there's the task. Okay, it's from here to there, and is that doable, right? So maybe they could wheel themselves at home or in the classroom, but the task is too hard, too far potentially. And then there's the environment. So is there a ramp? How steep is that ramp? How is their wheelchair, right? So she motor skills and motor learning talks about the person within their environment and the task. Key population are children with deficits in motor programming or motor control. Populations, could be children with cerebral palsy, children with motor control issues, things like that, right? So it's a little bit more concrete type of theory. So we're going to look at things like motor issues versus perceptual issues, potentially. All right, let's talk a little bit more about it. So it's based on motor learning motor control, and motor development. And we know that this happens in a particular way. We're learning more all the time, but we know that there's a trajectory. Also, dynamic systems theory. So a variety of different factors contribute to one's ability to learn, to engage, to build skills. And finally, learning theory, which cannot be overestimated, the importance of this, because how we teach a child and how the child takes in information and learns is as important as the other pieces. If we're teaching in a way that is not received, it's as if we've never taught anything at all. An example of this is, I am a pediatric therapist, and a lot of the kids that come to see me no longer have a lot of persistence, or maybe they didn't have persistence to start with. So say we're learning to use a new kind of swing, and it's a pretty tippy swing, right? So they'll get on it, they'll try it once, they can't balance, they'll say, I don't want to do this, or it's boring, or I'm done, right? And what motor skills acquisition would say, and learning theory, is that a person has to do something a minimum of about 5 times in order to get the quote unquote hang of it. And so in my teaching of motor skills, I'm going to talk about hanging on. I'm going to talk about gripping with the thighs. I'm going to talk about the environment and how the swing moving faster or slower and what's around is going to impact teaching. But I'm also going to talk about the fact that we don't learn things in one try. And this is only practice, right? So these 3 different aspects or theoretical foundations go into MSA. We also think about a function dysfunction on a continuum. Deficits in motor control and motor planning, deficits in timing and sequencing, because that's really important with motor, and also the characteristics of the task. Postulates of change is a really fancy way of saying, like, what's the guts of MSA? And these are 2 things. One is that disorganized capacities in the neuromotor system over time and with practice will become more organized and refined. The other is that we have movement synergies or coordinated structures within our body that will help us to develop patterns. And those patterns can be used to push our clients towards skilled movement. In terms of intervention within the MSA, it's very specific. There's implicit learning, so we do it and we get something. Practice is really important, and it's random and varied. So if I say to a child, we're going to work on throwing a ball, and I stand 3 feet away and we use a large playground ball, and they throw with the same distance, the same ball, the same person, me, all the time, that is not going to be as effective as if I use different balls, as if I stand different distances away, as if I do the practice with me and then with somebody who's shorter or somebody who's taller or another child, right? So practice being random and varied is super important. We also use feedback in MSA, and it's focused on the goals, not so much on, wow, what a great person you are, as well done getting the ball all the way to me when I was standing 8 feet away, right? So it's focused on the goal. The goal is throwing. The feedback is going to be about throwing. This sounds like super logical and like a no-brainer, but when we're in relationship with another human being, for most of us, we want to praise them, right? And that's fine, but that reinforcement needs to be geared towards the goal of the activity. Hopefully that makes sense. Bring any questions you have to class, and I'll happily go over stuff. All right. The other piece is that the feedback is intermittent. So if, say, we, in the course of the session, throw a ball 20 times, right? I'm not going to say every single time, good job, good job, good job, good job. What do you think happens when you do that? Well, for most of us, the feedback stops having any impact, right? And even as I was saying, good job, good job, good job, yep, 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 right? It turns into gibberish. It stops impacting the client because you're saying it all the time. So we want to have intermittent feedback after a particularly good trial. After a number of trials, we might say you're working really hard, even if they're totally bombing on the throwing, right? But so it's not constant and not consistent over the trials. All right, I won't belabor that anymore. I think it's really a very interesting thing, though. Okie dokie, biomechanical. Let me get a drink. So this supports the capacities of the person to increase their own function. The primary focus is on positioning. So with motor skills acquisition, it's on movement and motor skills. This is on positioning. It's used for children with neuromuscular and orthopedic disorders. Again, there's a function-dysfunction continuum. The integrity of the musculoskeletal system is a part of it. How messed up is the kid, basically? Central or postural stability. So we look at head control and we also look at trunk stability and how we can foster that, either externally or by building strength and endurance. And then also, how well can they control their limbs? The goals of biomechanical positioning intervention are these: normalize tone, decrease the influence of pathological reflexes. In other words, those reflexes that the child is compelled to perform even beyond the time when those reflexes should have been integrated and are no longer present. Good examples would be the child is compelled to an asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. We also want to work on increasing range of motion and preventing deformities. So sometimes a child, especially if they have some pretty serious musculoskeletal issues, we can't maintain an increased range of motion. So what we're going to work on is preventing deformity. So preventing contractures, preventing increased contractures if they're already present. We also want to increase stability, facilitate typical movement, and to maximize function. Here are a couple pieces of equipment that do some of these things, right? And as you can see, there's a great deal of external support that is enabling the child to use the function that they have to be engaged in functional activity. All right, next up, neurodevelopmental treatment. It was developed in the 1950s by Berta and Carol Bobath, a physical therapist and dancer. It's a neurological and developmental framework for treating CP and other movement disorders. It's really known to go with CP. And notice that it's both neurological and developmental, so it pulls from two different theories. Its theoretical foundation is normalized movement, right? That these synergistic patterns that are atypical due to a condition are not helping the child. Again, a function-dysfunction continua. So here's the breakdown. The original pathology, let's say CP, results in atypical tone, synergies, primitive reflexes, and then the child compensates for this original pathology by fixing That's like when a child locks their knees if they don't have sufficient strength or coordination to remain standing. They'll fix their knees and their hips and just lock them into place to keep themselves standing. It works, but it's not so great if you actually want to walk, right? Also, limiting degrees of freedom. So if a joint moves in 3 degrees of freedom, they might press back against something so that there's only 2 degrees of movement to have to worry about, right? So more degrees of freedom of movement is great for mobility, but it also results in less stability. Tone changes, and then the habit becomes motor programs. So motor programs are ways of engaging in motor activity that become habitual, and they may not be a really great solution to what the child wants and needs to do. The short-term or ST implications are contractures and inefficient postural control, and the long-term implications are increased deformities and increased disability. All right, so treatment. And we're going to later on this in the semester do a whole movement and NDT based unit where you'll actually be engaging and doing a lot of hands-on NDT informed intervention and practice with each other. So stay tuned for that. It's really it's a powerful demonstration of this theory. So intervention, use of handling and movement facilitation techniques in activity. So that's pretty awesome, right? It's not just handling and movement facilitation, but it's within activity, which is the ultimate goal, right? We want the kid to be engaged in functional activity. So it uses range of motion, management of tone, aligning posture, controlling posture. If the child has synergies, we're going to try to put them to functional use rather than maladaptive use. And we're going to look at sequences of movement, not just discrete movement. So we'll get more into that as we go, but that's a little intro. In terms of handling and facilitation, graded sensory input provided by the therapist's hands at key points of control on the child's body facilitate typical movement. And here you can see 3 pictures of NDT in action. So you see that in the first picture on the left, the therapist has the child on her lap and the child is actually leaning against her torso. So we're limiting the degrees of freedom, right? We're also breaking up some of the synergistic pattern of the lower extremities wanting to adduct, internally rotate, and flex, and that is a pretty typical pattern with children with CP. So the therapist is inserting her knee in between the child's legs in order to break that up, and she's giving her some support from the back, right? So looks like just above the hips. So graded input, right? Tactile input, therapist's hands, key points. So the hips and the pelvis are really key because it's our biggest joint, and everything revolves, if you will, around that key point. But also shoulders can be a good point to help facilitate movement from another large joint. And the movements that's being facilitated is turning, right? So rotary, rotational movement. In the second picture, there's some control at the hips as the child leans forward towards that ball. And in the last picture, the child is upright. And again, you can see that there's some facilitation happening above the hips, but at the torso, so that that child can maintain more easily and effectively an upright posture. Okay. Our last theory is sensory integration. And we're going to spend 2 class sessions on this later in the semester. So this is just a little taste. This is Jean Ayres, the founder of sensory integration. And she said sensory integration is the neurological process that organizes sensation from one's body and from the environment and makes it possible to use the body effectively within the environment. 1972. So what does that mean? Well, it means that input from all 8 of our senses, vision, hearing, taste, smell, touch, proprioception, vestibular, and interoception, which is the feelings that we have in our internal organs and through our smooth muscles, all of that gets organized so that it informs movement. It also informs self-regulation. We'll talk a little bit about that. So the sensorimotor processing cycle is we get input from the senses, process it in the brain, motor output, and we get feedback from our environment, which then leads into the cycle again. So here's a take-home point. So if you got a little sleepy or distracted, bring yourself back for a minute. Sensory goes to the brain for processing, and it affects motor ability or praxis, right? So part A of sensory integration is that sensory impacts motor. If we don't have vestibular working, we can't balance. We can't balance, a lot of motor is lost to us, right? Same with proprioception, knowledge of the body in space. Same with the eyes working to help the body move through space. Same with tactile and feeling the body parts on a floor, on a surface, etc. So sensory informs motor ability, part 1. Part 2, sensory affects self-regulation. So if we have sensory overload, in other words, too much coming in all at once, and this is just one example of a number of different kinds of sensory integration dysfunction that can happen. Brain doesn't process the information well, and we result in a fight, flight, fright, or freeze. We used to say it was a fight or flight response, mediated from the sympathetic nervous system, right? We go into emergency mode. Now we know that there's also a fright response or a freeze response, so deer in the headlights. So part 2 of sensory integration and its importance is that it affects our self-regulation. In other words, our ability to be alert enough and also calm and organized enough to respond to events in our daily life. As I said, we'll go over it in much more detail, but that's just a little preview. A couple other slides. This is a taxonomy proposed by Lucy Jane Miller in 2004, and she looked at sensory processing disorder, or SPD, and she looked at 3 different types: modulation, discrimination, and sensory-based motor disorder. So the modulation is, in fact, that self-regulation piece, right? You either are over-responsive, under-responsive, or you're seeking and craving sensation. On the other side of things, there's the sensory-based motor disorder, which is how sensory integration affects motor ability. And in between is sensory discrimination disorder. So this is not the protective part of the nervous system, but the discriminatory part, which contributes to our ability to engage in very precise movement and very graded movement. So we have 2 goals in working on sensory processing and integration. One is to support optimal arousal, and you'll see here in this visual display that we want to be around that dotted line, right? If we are if we're too high, we can't engage in adaptive responses. And if we're too low, we can't engage in adaptive responses. So we want to be in that top bracket, right? What is an adaptive response? It's the ability to engage in attention or paying attention, learning, and performing. And performance, again, is not just physical performance, but any kind of performance. Tending to the environment, social interaction, motor skills, all of that. So that's goal 1. Goal 2, support the development of motor skill. You're in the home stretch here. Bear with me for just a few more minutes. So, core elements of sensory integration treatment. And it bears mentioning at this point that I have advanced certification in sensory integration. So I am your go-to for all things SI, and I love to talk about it. So please bring your questions to class. If you want to talk about it in other contexts, please just hook up with me. I'm happy to talk with you about it and also give you resources. All right, so core elements. Enhanced sensory experiences. So we're going to very pragmatically and consciously provide sensory experiences to our clients. We're going to support optimal arousal, not too high, not too low. We're going to provide something called a just right challenge, and Jean Ayres actually came up with this term. It's basically something that is not too hard and not too easy. Kind of hooks up with zone of the proximal development a little bit. But it's not based on how the adult or the environment can help you. It's just based on where is that child and where's their learning edge or their developmental progression going, and what's that next step. It's also based on intrinsic motivation and active engagement. So it's not a behavioral strategy, it's the opposite. So we're not going to try to engage a child for an M&M. We're going to engage them because it's fun, it feels good, it is satisfying, and it promotes their internal and external selves to go, wow, this is great. Maybe in not so many words. Also, we collaborate in activity choice with the client. So in a sensory integration session, I'm not setting everything up and then telling the child they have to do it. I'm giving them choice and collaborating with them. Now, I'm not giving them free rein either, but I am helping them make decisions that are going to be therapeutic without letting them know that. So then we have the adaptive response, which varies from child to child, but the adaptive response is the ability to engage in functional activity. We want to guide self-organization for the child, and we want to build a therapeutic alliance, which is the therapeutic use of self and also building rapport and trust, so that child actually wants to show up and take the risks that are necessary to build their sensory integration foundation and their functional abilities growing out of that foundation. This is a typical environment where sensory integration session might happen. It's got suspended equipment. It's very safe. It's very colorful and inviting. It's got a lot of opportunities for different kinds of movement and stimulating different sensory systems. And we'll go more into that as well. Last slide, I believe. Almost last, second to last. All right. So I just want to give you a preview of this. What are our goals when we work on sensory integration? Well, weirdly, it's not just like the child's vestibular is not working well, so we're going to strengthen that. We want to support systems that are not working well, but we want to also work on the senses that are working well. So the idea of the sensory integration is that all 8 of the senses are working together to support the child, right? So it goes to show that if we strengthen the working senses, right? So if a child has great prop and vision, let's use propen vision to help support vestibular until vestibular can become a little bit more functional. We also want to compensate when necessary. What does that mean? Well, it's not always going to be that a child is going to be able to change their neurological system and be just fine, right? So we might say that if their vestibular system's not functioning all that great, let's teach them how to use their vision to help with balance, right? And so we help put in compensatory measures as well. And then we want to look at preventing overload rather than reacting to overload once it's happened. So with kids with sensory integration issues, they often develop avoidant behaviors and explosive behaviors because they're trying to avoid the things that are super uncomfortable and hard. So if we can identify what those may be and help that child prevent situations where they're going to be super uncomfortable or feel like they're they're in pain or not at ease, that will go far in terms of getting them to buy into therapy, getting them to trust, and actually moving their skills forward. I hope that made a little sense. We'll talk more about it and bring your questions to class. All right, this is your third and final prep activity. And again, these preparatory activities are not like you have to sign into Canvas and reply to a discussion. But I want you to think about them so that when we get to class, we can have a rich and robust discussion and we can move our discussion forward. So either review the case study for Angela or James. Those are on Canvas and we'll be using them all semester long. Then think about what models or frames of reference might be appropriate to work with this child. This is upcoming in an assignment, so it will benefit you to do this now. And then support your argument and be prepared to discuss it in class. All right, y'all, that's what I got. Good work sticking with it. We're at the end of our theory lecture, and I will see you in class. So be sure to jot down your questions, bring them to class. Feel free to email me, and I'll see you real soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye for now.